Hey, well, I just started the stream, and I'm looking around, and I don't, my voice is better, but I can still tell it's dry. So, what I'm gonna do is get my liquids here and put them here, because I'm gonna try to get the rest of the time in playing. I've got a new thing that I'm going to try, so just bear with me for just a minute, and I'll start the music. It's going to be in the. If you want to grab your instrument and join in with me, I wish you would. It's A Phrygian dominant, and you play according to your pattern there, and you can't go wrong. All right, so be right back. I'm back in the saddle again. I can't believe we used to listen to stuff like that. How awful was it? Oh, Lord, it was terrible. Let's see. Oh. All right, I got some notifications here for lag frames, which I don't know. Yeah, it's troubling, right? But in any event, like I've mentioned before on my stream, that we found what is it? Brian Eno and David Byrne, "My Life in the Bush of Ghosts." It's a great inspirational idea. And I've tried one of the things I've been working on, and I want to try this now. I hope it's not too terrible. But this time, when I'm doing the A Phrygian dominant, I'm going to try for a little while at least to accompany it with this text reader, and I hope I hope it works. But I'm just gonna do it anyway, and try to figure out what's needed. I have to come back and listen to it myself and think about it and try to come up with solutions. But let's get this thing started. All right, stop.
Equalization. Next day, January 29, 1790, the Jews of Paris obtained a certificate, couched in most flattering terms, and testifying to their excellent reputation, from the inhabitants of the district of the Carmelites, where most Jews dwelt at this time. The 6 deputies appointed for the district of the Carmelites then went to the city hall, to support the resolution in favor of the Jews. One of them, Cain of Girdle, afterwards a minister, delivered an impressive address. "Do not be surprised," said he, "that this district hastens to be the first to make public recognition of the patriotism, the courage, and the nobility of the Jews who dwell in it. No citizen has proved himself more zealous for the gaining of liberty than the Jew, none has displayed more sense of order and justice, none shown more benevolence towards the poor, and readiness in voluntarily contributing towards the expenses of the district. Let us attack all prejudices, and attack them with determination. that not one of the monstrosities of despotism and ignorance survived the new birth of liberty and the consecration of the rights of man. Take into consideration the just and pressing demands in favor of our new brethren, and join your wishes to their petition, so that thus united they may come before the National Assembly. Do not doubt but that you will obtain, without trouble, for the Jews of Paris that which was not denied the Jews of Portugal, Spain, and elsewhere. What reason is there for 445 showing a preference for this class? Do not all Jews hold the same doctrines? Are not our political conditions alike for the one as for the other? If the ancestors of those Jews on whose behalf we plead experienced more bitter suffering and persecution than the Portuguese Jews, then this long, cruel oppression which they have sustained should give them a new claim to national justice. For the rest, look to the origin of these strange and unjust distinctions, and see whether any one today dares set up a distinction of rights between two classes of the same people, two branches of the same stem, basing his action upon apocryphal tradition, or rather upon chimeras and fables. To this speech the President Ali Mulek replied, bringing into prominence the fact that the report from the district of the Carmelites was to be considered of great weight in favor of the Jews. The next speech, that of Adi Bertolini, at length induced the meeting to add its favorable testimony to the Jews of Paris, and to express the wish to the National Assembly that these Jews, most of them of German birth, be put on an equal footing with the Portuguese. Mayor Bailey and his committee on the same day passed the resolution, that as soon as the other districts announced their approval, the whole weight of the influence of the municipality of Paris be exerted on behalf of the equalization of the Jews. In the course of the following month all the city districts, with the exception of that of the Pals, sent in their approval of the decision of the Carmelite district. Accordingly, a deputation of the Commune, together with its president, Ali Mulek, officially commissioned by the capital February 25th, presented itself at the meeting of the National Assembly, to request, or rather by moral suasion to compel, that body to extend to Jews resident in Paris the decree declaring the Portuguese Jews full citizens. For 46 hours delay, certain deputies demanded April 15th, that the Jewish question be placed on the order of the day. Ali Mori again opposed the motion, and promised to present a memorial which the Jews should be called upon to answer. In order, however, to protect the Jews of Alsace from the attacks of mobs, the Assembly again decreed that they were under protection of the laws, and that the magistrates and the National Guard were to take precautions for their security. In this way they appeased their consciences. The king forthwith sanctioned April 18th, the law of protection for the Alsatian Jews, after which the question was not broached for 3 months. Fortunately the Jewish question did not stand isolated, but was connected with other questions. The Jews of Alsace, especially those of Metz, had to pay high protection taxes. When the subject of finances came on for discussion, the Assembly had to determine whether this tax should continue or cease. They came to a liberal decision, although the deputies were sorely troubled about the deficit thus created. The secretary of the Committee of the Crown Land, Visms, first showed how unjust it was that the community of Metz, which Louis XIV, once when in good humor, had given to the Duke of Brancas and the Countess de Frontaine, should pay annually to the House of Brancas 20,000 francs. He therefore proposed that the Jew taxes should be remitted without any indemnification, and that every tribute, under whatever name protection money, residence tax, or tolerance money hold cease. This proposal was passed into law July 20, almost without opposition. Louis XVI, who by this act saw another remnant of the Middle Ages vanish, at first showed himself tardy in confirming the law August 7. 10 years previously the Jews of Alsace had in vain presented a memorial to the State Council detailing the misery of their condition. 447 had received no notice. Owing to the sudden revolution of affairs, they now achieved in less than an hour more than they had ever dared hope for. But the National Assembly would not proceed to deal with the chief demand of the Jews of the Lower Rhine, as these districts were then called, grant them civil rights. Several had expressed themselves favorably, when the Duc de Broglie intervened with a violent speech. He asserted that the proposed resolution would engender new causes of excitement in Lorraine and Alsace, already in a state of famine owing to the action of the clergy who refused to take the oath. Strasbourg was likewise greatly excited on account of the Jews, who desired to settle there, where hitherto no Jew had been permitted. De Broglie further remarked that the general body of Jews in Alsace was utterly indifferent to citizenship, that the petition presented in their name was an intrigue carried on by 4 served there, was scattering large sums of money most liberally in Paris, to gain adherence for the scheme of equalization. His motion to adjourn this question till the Constitution was finished was carried. But the Constitution was definitely fixed and ratified by the King September 1791, and the German-speaking Jews of France did not obtain the equality so often promised. Only the paragraph in the Rights of Man, which said that no one might be molested on account of his religious opinions, benefited them. At last, a few days before the dissolution of the National Assembly, the Jews were remembered by one of the Friends of Liberty, Duport, a member of the Jacobin Club, formerly a parliamentary councillor. In a speech of a few words he procured the equality they so much desired. He drew the natural conclusion from the above-quoted rights of religious freedom, and said, I believe that freedom 448 of thought does not permit any distinction in political rights on account of a man's creed. The recognition of this equality is always being postponed. Meanwhile the Turks, Muslims, and men of all sects, are permitted to enjoy political rights in France. I demand that the motion for adjournment be withdrawn, and a decree passed that the Jews in France enjoy the privileges of citizenship citoyens actifs. This proposition was accepted amid loud applause. In vain did Noble strive to oppose the motion, he was interrupted. Another member suggested that everyone who spoke against this motion be called to order, because he would be opposing the Constitution itself. Thus the National Assembly adopted September 27, 1791, Duport's proposal, and next day formulated the law that all exceptional regulations against Jews be abrogated, and that the German Jews be admitted to the oath of citizenship. 2 days later the National Assembly was dissolved, to make way for a still more violent revolutionary assembly. A few days later Louis XVI confirmed this full equalization of the French Jews November 13, 1791. They were not required to swerve one iota from their religion as the price of emancipation. All demanded of them being that they forego certain ancient privileges. Their Isaac Beer was justified in rejoicing at this success, in which he had had a large share. He at once dispatched a letter of congratulation to his co-religionists, to rouse enthusiasm for their newly attained freedom, and at the same time incline them to appropriate improvements. At length the day has arrived on which the veil is torn asunder which covered us with humiliation. We have at last again obtained the rights of which we have been deprived for 18 centuries. How deeply at this moment should we recognize the wonderful grace of the God of our forefathers. On the 27th September we were the only inhabitants of this great realm who seemed doomed to eternal humiliation and slavery, and on the very next day, a memorable day which we shall always commemorate, didst thou inspire these immortal legislators of France to utter one word which caused 60,000,449 unhappy beings, who had hitherto lamented their hard lot, to be suddenly plunged into the intoxicating joys of the purest delight. God chose the noble French nation to reinstate us in our due privileges, and bring us to a new birth, just as in former days he selected Antiochus and Pompey to degrade and oppress us. This nation asks no thanks, except that we show ourselves worthy citizens. Bear added certain important, timely remarks, in which he gently pointed out to his French co-religionists faults growing out of their former wretched plight, and admonished them to remove these faults. He also supplied the French Jews with means to enable them to become thorough Frenchmen and at the same time remain members of the house of Jacob. The Bible was to be rendered into French on the basis of Mendelssohn's German translation, and put into the hands of the young, so that the corrupt German language which they use might be completely banished from their midst. Bear thus attacked a foolish prejudice which regarded the German or Jewish German dialect as akin in sanctity to the Hebrew, therefore a more worthy organ for divine service than the language of Voltaire. Bear was thoroughly imbued with the conviction that Judaism was in every way compatible with liberty, civilization, and patriotism for the country which had restored to his co-religionists their rights as men. Bear was a better disciple of Mendelssohn than David Friedel during the Berlin Jews. With great assiduity and self-sacrifice, most of the French Jews interested themselves in the welfare of the state which had given them a fatherland, liberty, and equality. They destroyed at one blow all the calumniations of their opponents, who had asserted that as Jews they would not be able to fulfill the duties of citizens. They came to the front whenever the state stood in need of help. A large number of Jews in this feverish time calling forth courageous action, threw aside with wonderful rapidity the shy, grovelling manner which had 450 debarred them from intercourse with the world, and had subjected them to general ridicule. When the French legions, inspired by freedom, had put to rout the mercenary troops of Germany, Moses and Schein, the Hebrew poet of the Mendelssohn school, composed a fiery triumphal hymn, similar to the Song of Deborah, which was solemnly chanted in the synagogue. The Jews, however, took no part whatever in the bloody atrocities of the revolution. In the frenzy of the reign of terror, which like a scourge of God fell upon the innocent and the guilty, some Jews also suffered. The familiarity of the Jews with persecutions, their acuteness, and the dexterity with which they faced themselves, their obedience to the precept, "Bend thy head a moment, till the storm is past," protected them against widespread massacre. In general, they were not stirred by the ambition to thrust themselves forward, or a desire to take part in affairs. Nor did they give offense to the rulers of the hour. Thus the storm of the revolution rushed over them without serious results. The attack upon a belief in God, when the two blaspheming deputies, Schmidt and Hebert, succeeded in inducing the convention in November, May 1793, 1794, to set up the religion of reason, had likewise no effect upon the Jews. The intense hostility and anger felt to religion and the divinity were directed only against Catholicism, or Christianity, by whose servants mankind had ever been degraded, who themselves had sacrificed myriads of victims, and during the Revolution had fomented a civil war. The Reign of Terror, the Massacre of September, and the guillotine, had been conjured up by them almost as a sad, stern necessity, because, together with the feudal aristocracy, they were bitter enemies of freedom. The decree of the convention ran thus: the Catholic faith is 451 annulled, and replaced by the worship of reason. This represented not alone the mood of the most advanced, the Jacobins. It was the inclination of the French people to oppose the Church and its followers fiercely, because of a feeling that they are naturally hostile to liberty. 20 days after the resolution of the convention had been passed, more than 2,300 churches were transformed into temples of reason. The law included no provisions against Jews and Protestants. Only the magistrates or fanatically inclined members of clubs in the provinces, principally, it appears, in the old German districts, extended the order for the suppression of religion to the Jews also. In Nancy, an official demanded of the Jews of the town, in the name of the city council, that they attend on an appointed day at the National Temple, and together with the clergy of other creeds renounce their superstition, and further surrender all the silver and golden vessels of the synagogue. Brutal and riotous men forced their way into the synagogues, tore the holy writings from the arks and burned them, or searched the houses for books written in Hebrew in order to destroy them. Prayers in the synagogues of certain congregations were forbidden just as in the churches. By reason of the spy system which the Revolutionary Club supported, to enable them to oppose the imminent counter-revolution, even private meetings for religious purposes were attended with great danger. When the order of the convention was issued, decreeing that every 10th day be observed as a day of rest, and making Sunday a working day, the mayors of certain cities, as of Strasbourg and Troyes, extended this decree also to the Sabbath. They commanded that Jewish merchants display their wares for sale on the Sabbath. In agricultural districts, Jews were compelled, on the Sabbath and on Jewish holidays, to mow and gather in the crops, and rabbis as well as 452 bishops were molested. David Sinsheim, who lived in Strasbourg, and afterwards became president of the great French Sanhedrin, was forced to flee from town to escape imprisonment or death. In Metz the Jews dared not openly bake their Passover cakes, until a clever Jewish matron had the courage to explain to the officers of the revolution that this bread had always been a symbol of freedom with the Jews. In Paris, Jewish schoolmasters were compelled to conduct their pupils to the Temple of Reason, into which the Church of Notre Dame had been transformed on the day of Hadi. However, this persecution passed away with situation of the French Jews, once definitely settled, remained untouched through all changes of government. The new constitution of the year 3 of the Republic, or the Constitution of the Directory Autumn of 1795, recognized the adherents of Judaism, without further difficulty, as on an equal footing with all around them. Moreover, it wiped away the last trace of inequality, inasmuch as the Catholic Church was no more than the synagogue acknowledged to be the state church. The law laid down the fundamental proposition that no one can be compelled to contribute to the expenses of a church establishment, as the Republic subsidized none. Only the community of Metz had to suffer under some baneful effects of the Middle Ages. Together with the victorious French troops of the Republic, the deliverance of the Jews, of the most oppressed race of the ancient world, advanced from one place to another. It took firm root in Holland, which had been changed into a Batavian Republic beginning of 1795. Here several energetic 453 Jews, among them Asser Moses and Caramus, de Lemon, and Bronet, had joined a club, called Felix Libertate, which had taken the motto of the French Republic: liberty, equality, and fraternity. These state maxims were on the whole adopted by the assembled States General March 4, 1795. Although the 50,000 Jews of Holland, who formed the 39th part of the whole population of the country, and were divided into the Portuguese and German communities, might justly have regarded this land as their paradise, they had hitherto been laboring under many disadvantages as compared with Christians. They were suffered to exist only as corporate bodies, little commonwealths, as it were, in the midst of larger ones. That they were excluded from public offices did not trouble them. But they were also debarred from several trade guilds, and this was a matter of great importance to them. They had to contribute to the ruling church establishment and to its schools without deriving any benefit therefrom. Also, there was no lack of vexatious grievances. In Amsterdam, for instance, when a Jewish couple went to register their wedding, they were compelled to wait till Christians had been attended to, and, besides, to pay double fees. On this account the demand for equalization became pressing, more on the part of the German than on that of the Portuguese Jews, the latter, wealthy and of noble birth, being generally treated with distinction by the patricians, whilst the Germans were despised as wretched fools. In the first excitement of the agitation several disabilities of the Jews of Holland or Batavia were removed, and voices were raised in favor of their admission to full civil rights. But later on, as in France, writings hostile to the Jews roused public opinion against them. Amongst these Van Sweeden's work, entitled Advice to the Representatives of the People, especially produced a great impression. 454 he asserted that owing to their origin, their character, their history, and their belief in the Messiah, the Jews remained strangers, and could not be absorbed by the state. This statement was in a measure accepted by the official representatives of Judaism as correct. For strangely enough the rabbis and administrators of Jewish affairs, especially the powerful Parnasim in Amsterdam, alike in the Portuguese and German communities, were averse to equalization. They feared that Judaism would suffer from the great freedom of the Jews and from their new duties, such as military service. In a circular letter they declared that the Jews renounced citizenship, seeing that it was opposed to the commands of Holy Writ. Within a short time this declaration was covered with more than 1,000 signatures. Although Jews were invited, but few took part in the election of the First Batavia National Assembly Nationale Vergadering. Thus it happened that Amsterdam, which contained more than 20,000 Jews, did not return a single Jewish deputy. The Jewish Friends of Liberty in Holland were in a sorry plight, having to combat enemies within and without. They were driven to exert all their energy to overcome this double difficulty. David Friedrichsfeld, a member of the school of the Meesman, who had settled in Amsterdam, composed an excellent work about 1795, against the assailants of the Jews, called Investigation of Van Sweeden's work in reference to the civil rights of the Jews. Beside him, 6 distinguished and intelligent Jews, also them of German descent, equal to the greatest zeal to accomplish the emancipation of the Jews of Holland. They were, first Bronet, who had long lived in Suriname, where he was recognized as a free citizen, and thence he had brought a knowledge of politics Moses Asser, who had been appointed Knight of the Belgian Order of the Lion. Another Asser, Carolus, and 455 Isaac de Jong, all distinguished members of the German community. Only two of the Portuguese community participated in the endeavor to obtain equalization of rights, the highly respected physician Ernst de Lehmann, and Jacob Sasportas. They presented a petition to the Batavian National Assembly March 29, 1796, which held its sittings at the Hague, demanding the emancipation of the Batavian Jews as a right. Inasmuch as they were citizens of the Batavian Republic, possessing the franchise, and had already exercised civil rights, they prayed the Assembly to declare that they might enjoy this privilege in its entirety. The National Assembly considered the petition, and appointed a commission to advise and decide upon it. When the Jewish question came on for discussion August 1796, excitement ran high, and the tension between the parties was great. Although the emancipation of the Jews in the Batavian Republic had been recognized in principle, and practically acknowledged by the permission to vote at the election, there were still many opponents to contend against, almost more than in France. The conservative Dutch deputies in their hearts believed firmly in the Bible, and they considered as the Word of God the writings of the New Testament, in which it was said that the Jews were outcasts, and should remain so. The relatively large number of Jews, their wealth, respectability, and intelligence, gave cause for grave fears that they would make their way into the highest offices of the state, and expel the Christians. 60 or 100,000 Jews, in the great territory of France, were lost like a grain of sand in an immense plain, but 50,000 among 2 millions, especially 20,000 Jews in Amsterdam among 200,000 Christians, might make themselves felt, and effect their purpose. One of the deputies, Leblanc de Jong, dwelt upon this state of affairs 456 with great emphasis. If the friends of the Jews pointed to America, where, as in France, they had recently attained to full civil rights, then he brought into prominence the unequal proportion of numbers. In Holland their great number would soon invest the populace with Jewish characteristics. The noble Portuguese might be admitted to full rights. But as to the German Jews, the majority of whom were outcasts, Leblanc de Jong quoted Pinto's work against Voltaire, in which he, a Jew himself, had plainly shown the vast difference between the Portuguese and the German Jews. Thus the artificial caste feeling, within the fold of Judaism, brought about its own revenge. The fear was still greater that the number of the Jews in Holland might be considerably increased by immigrants from Germany and Poland, whose goal, for a long time past, had been Amsterdam. Opponents to the scheme of equalization could further adduce the argument that the majority of Jews did not desire emancipation, and that the 6 petitioners had acted without authority. Durel, the French ambassador, in somewhat imperious fashion, took the first step in favor of the equalization of the Jews. After a long debate, the complete equality of the Batavian Jews was finally decreed September 2, 1796, with the addition, for those who wished to make use of it. Thereupon all earlier provincial and municipal laws which referred to their disabilities were abolished. The Jews in Holland did not receive the announcement of this decision with joy, as those in France, when the rights of equality had been granted them. They had not felt the deprivation of liberty enough to go into ecstasies about their new freedom. They had no ambition to obtain state offices, and saw in citizenship only a burden and a danger to religion. They therefore were embittered against those who had procured their equalization, and so had broken asunder the bonds which held the two congregations 457 together as corporate bodies. Thus there arose causes for dispute and internal dissension in Amsterdam. The liberal-minded, most of whom belonged to the German community, demanded that the regulations which endowed the rabbis, and to a great extent the partisan, or wardens, with powerful authority over the members, should be altered in accordance with the spirit of the age. The leaders of the community not only refused this demand, but even threatened the petitioners with fines. Upon this the advanced left the existing synagogue, established their own congregation, and declared that they constituted the real community Adam Jeshurun, formed at the end of 1796. The conservative members of the old community thereupon passed a kind of interdict upon the separatists, forbade their own congregants to have any intercourse, or to intermarry with them. The political divergence of opinion at the same time became a religious one. For the supporters of the new congregation, Adath Jeshurun initiated a sort of reform. They struck out of their ritual the formula of imprecation Vula Malchanum, which had originally been directed against the apostate Jewish Christians, but by misinterpretation was afterwards applied to all Christians. They abolished the practice of hastily burying the dead, and erected a new, clean communal bath, nascent reforms, which, however, were regarded by the strictly Orthodox as grave offenses against Judaism. The new congregation succeeded in having the fanatical leaders of the German community, who were more inconsiderate than the Portuguese in their opposition to those who had withdrawn from their midst, removed from their posts, probably through the action of the French ambassador Noël. Among the new council officers, members of the new congregation were elected. Gradually many of the 458 Old Party became reconciled to the new order of things and to the aspirations of the liberal-minded section. The Orthodox were also greatly flattered when two Jews, Bromet and de Levin, were elected as deputies for Amsterdam. Several attended at The Hague at the opening of the Second National Assembly September 1, 1797, to participate in the honor of the Jewish deputies. They were still more pleased with the idea of equalization when the Jewish deputy, Isaac Dalhouska Ashais, was successively elected a member of the City Council, of the National Assembly, and finally to the position of President of the same 1798. The head of the Batavian Republic, the Grand Pensioner Schimmelpenning, was in earnest about the emancipation of the Jews, and without hesitation appointed able Jews to public offices. The first appointment to public posts in Europe was made in Holland. It was natural that a sense of self-importance and honorable pride should be awakened in the breasts of the liberal members of the new congregation, among whom state offices were distributed. Indignation seized them when they saw that the Jews under the German princes were still treated as outcasts or wild beasts. They therefore laid a proposal before the National Assembly, entreating that the Batavian ambassador to the French Republic be instructed to move at the Peace Congress held at Rastatt, that the Dutch Jews in Germany should no longer be compelled to pay poll tax, and to threaten that, unless this was granted, all Germans journeying through Holland would be subjected to the same dishonorable treatment. The National Assembly agreed to this proposition. Righteous judgment soon overtook the German princes and people, who, stubborn as Pharaoh and the Egyptians, refused to loosen the chain of slavery from the Jews. They themselves were soon forced to become the servie camera of the French 459 Republic, and to pay a poll tax. Wherever in Germany and Italy the courageous French obtained firm footing, the Jews were made free. The walls of the ghetto were burst open, and bent figures stood erect. The name of the invincible French, who had achieved wonderful victories in Italy, quickly spread abroad, even beyond Europe, and aroused terror and surprise in the most remote countries. A new Alexander, the Corsican Bonaparte, a god of war when scarcely 30 years old, set out with a comparatively small army to subdue Egypt, and hoped to penetrate to India. In less than 6 months, July-November, 1798, Egypt lay crushed at his feet. But a Turkish army was on its way to meet him, against which Bonaparte advanced into Palestine. Thus, through a marvelous series of historical events, the Holy Land became the scene of a bloody war between the representatives of the old and the new spirit in Europe. El Arish and Gaza in the southwest of Palestine fell into the hands of the French army, which scarcely numbered 12,000 men 17th and 25th February, 1799. The Jewish community of Gaza had fled. In Jerusalem the news of French victories and cruelty created a panic. It was rumored that Napoleon was about to enter the Holy City. At the command of the Sub-Pasha, or Motu Salim, the inhabitants began to throw up ramparts, the Jews taking part in the work. One of their rabbis, Mordecai Joseph Iachez, encouraged and even assisted them in their operations. The Turks had circulated the report that the French treated Jews particularly in a cruel manner. Bonaparte had issued a summons to the Asiatic and African Jews to march under his banners, promising to give them the Holy Land, and restore ancient Jerusalem to its pristine splendor. But the Jews in Jerusalem appear even not to have trusted in these flattering 460 words, or to have been utterly ignorant of the proclamation. Probably it was only a trick on the part of Bonaparte, intended to win over to his side the Jewish minister of the Pasha of Akko, Shayamalim Karki, assassinated in 1820, the soul of the defense of the important sea fortress of Akko. Had Bonaparte succeeded in conquering Syria and carrying the war into the heart of Turkey, he would perhaps have assigned a share in his government to members of the Jewish nation upon whom the French could rely. But the appearance of Bonaparte in Palestine was like that of a terrible meteor, which disappears after causing much devastation. His dream to become emperor of the East, and restore Jerusalem to the Jews, quickly faded away. The growing enthusiasm for France, where his enthralled co-religionists had been freed, had created a Jewish poet in Elia Levy, while a Jewish youth was aroused to become a spirited orator, whose eloquence was always tinged with poetry. Michael Beer, born 1780, died 1843, a worthy son of Isaac Beer, who had so zealously striven for the emancipation of the Jews of France, in his youth aroused great hopes, by reason of his handsome, noble form, and his manifold talents. In him for the first time Jewish and French spirit met in harmonious combination. He was the first Jewish attorney in France. Animated by the ambition of courageous youth and in the glow of his fiery spirit, this young man conceived a bold idea, at the beginning of the new century, when peace was concluded. A Congress of the Princes of Europe was expected to take place. To them and their people Michael Beer addressed a summons in the name of all the inhabitants of Europe professing the Jewish religion, praying them to free his co-religionists from oppression, and to guarantee to them the justice so long withheld. This youth voiced the hopes of rejuvenated Israel. Beer's summons was 461 especially directed to the Germans, both to princes and nations, who still treated the Jews living in their midst as branded servi camera. Beer, who was inspired with love for his co-religionists, preached to deaf ears, his burning words and convincing arguments finding no response in the hearts of the Eastern European people. In Austria, Russia, and the numerous smaller German states, the Jews remained in their former abasement. In Berlin itself, the seat of enlightenment, Jewish physicians, however honorable their reputation, were not included in the list of their Christian fellow practitioners, but were enumerated by themselves, relegated, as it were, to a medical ghetto. Two men of the first rank, the greatest poet and the greatest thinker of the time, G.H. and Fichte, shared in the prejudices of the Germans against the Jews, and made no secret of it. G.H., the representative of the aristocratic world, and Fichte, the defender of democratic opinion in Germany, both desired to see the Jews removed like laid patients beyond the pale of Christian society. Both were on bad terms with the Church, both looked upon Christianity with its belief in miracles as a folly, and both were considered atheists. Nevertheless they abhorred the Jews in the name of Jesus. G.H.'s intolerance against the Jews cannot be taken as the expression of his personal prejudice. He only showed how the current of opinion flowed in cultured German circles. Fichte, the one-sided compliment of Kant, was still more savage and embittered against the Jews. Like most German metaphysicians, his philosophy was of a visionary nature before the outbreak of the French Revolution. Apparently Fichte bestowed great honor upon the Jews when he put them on a level with the nobility and the clergy. But he did not wish in any way to honor them, but rather to accuse them before 462 the bar of public opinion. Fichte, the philosophical thinker, cherished the same ill will against the Jews and Judaism as G.H., the aristocratic poet, and Schleiermacher, the Gnostic preacher. Should civil rights be granted to Jews? Fichte opposed it in a most decided fashion. Not even in a Christian state, in his view a petty state, contrary to right and reason, should they be emancipated. The only way I see by which civil rights can be conceded to them the Jews is to cut off all their heads in one night, and to set new ones on their shoulders, which should contain not a single Jewish idea. The only means of protecting ourselves against them is to conquer their promised land and send them thither. History judged otherwise. New heads have not been set on the Jews, but on the Germans themselves. His view was that Jews should not Vladimirian Bishop Lawfare, had not spoken of the Jews in so perverse and hateful a manner. Fichte may be regarded as the father and apostle of national German hatred of the Jews, of a kind unknown before, or rather never before so clearly manifested. Even Herder, although filled with admiration for Israel's antiquity and the people in its biblical splendor, he first to examine sacred literature from a poetical point of view felt an aversion to the Jews, which became apparent in his relations with Mendelssohn, whom it cost him an effort to treat in a friendly manner. Herder, it is true, prophesied a better time, when Christian and Jew would work together in concord on the structure of human civilization. But like Balaam of old, he pronounced his blessings upon Israel in a half-hearted way. This growing hostility to the Jews among the Germans was not noticed by 463 educated Jews who dwelt in their midst. At least they did not combat it vigorously. Only one pamphlet from the pen of a Jewish author appeared at this time. Saul Asher wrote his Eisenhower II, an open letter to Fichte, but hardly any notice was taken of it. If the Jews met with no favor in the eyes of those who formed public opinion in Germany, who had raised it from antiquated customs to a brilliant height of culture, both in the democratic and the aristocratic camps, but experienced at their hands only revolts and scorn, how much worse was their relation to the great mass of the populace, still engulfed in the depths of darkest ignorance and crudeness. Two noble-minded Christians addressed to the Congress of Rastatt the soundest arguments that the German Jews should be raised from their ignominious condition. One of them, an unknown philanthropist, hurled the shaft of ridicule at the stupidity and bombastic hotness of the German Jew haters, and the other, Christian Grund, demonstrated with pitiless logic the injustice with which the Jews were treated. Both desired to support the demand of the Dutch Jews to the diplomatic representatives, that the princes of Germany be compelled to respect the Jews, and that influence be brought to bear upon public opinion to that effect. One acted as a clever advocate for the Jews. He complimented the Germans in order to win favor with them. The German Jews, said he, venture to approach the German nation, capable of great deeds, the creator of its own destinies, not merely an imitator of the actions of other peoples, uniting their voice with that of their brethren, to petition the representatives of the nation at Rastatt most respectfully for the abolition of those distinctions under which they live, and for the acquisition of greater rights. The answer of the German princes and rulers was not very encouraging. 464 The most disgraceful degradation and humiliation of the Jews consisted in the poll tax, an impost unknown outside of Germany. Of what advantage was it that Emperor Joseph of Austria and Frederick William II had remitted it? It still existed in all its hideousness in central and western Germany, in the districts of the Main and the Rhine, where diminutive states bordered close on other diminutive states of the extent of a square mile, and where turnpike after turnpike at short intervals presented itself. If a Jew took a day's journey, he passed through different territories, and at the borders of each had to pay a poll tax. A Jewish beggar, accompanied by his young son, once exhibited his poll tax bills, which amounted to $1.50 for 6 days, paid in various places. The way in which the tax was levied was more degrading than the duty of paying it. Very often the tax amounted to a few kreutzers, which only the poor, who were not exempt from it, felt as a burden. But the brutal procedure of the officers, and the ignominious treatment of each frontier line offended also the rich. As long as the French armies were encamped in German territory, the Jews escaped paying the poll tax. But no sooner was the peace of Belleville concluded, and the French troops withdrawn, than the petty German princes reimposed the tax, not in order to raise the small income derivable from this source, but to humiliate the Jews. They inflicted the insult also upon French Jews who crossed the Rhine for business purposes, defending their action by a literal construction of one of the articles of the Peace of Campo Formio, which stated, "All business and intercourse shall for the present continue under the same conditions as before the war." The French Jews, proud of their citizenship, would not submit, severed their business connections with Germany, and complained of the injustice to the French government, by whom the question was not 465 lightly passed over. The government commissioner John Lubbock dispatched a circular letter 1801, nation. Several small princes, like those of Soultz, gave heed, and forthwith removed the poll tax. From fear of the French Jews were freed from it, but it still weighed heavily upon German travelers. Every step towards the removal of oppressive restrictions in Germany was the result of grave exertions. In consequence of the Peace of Ellaville, the Holy Roman Empire was now for the first time dismembered. The representatives of the empire, assembled in Ratisbon, were driven to seek means of bringing their disunited members into some sort of order, or to decide upon the indemnity for the damage suffered. To this conference of the ambassadors of 8 princes, occupied with traffic and territory, and regarded by the short-sighted as representing the German nation, the German Jews presented a petition asking for passive citizenship November 15, 1802. This entreaty was drawn up in the name of the Jews of Germany, by State Attorney Christopher Grund. Which congregation, or what individual zealous for emancipation had commissioned him to do this is not exactly known. It appears that the petition originated in Frankfurt. It prayed that the representatives of the empire remove from the German Jews the burdensome distinctions under which they labored, that the narrow confines in which they were forced to reside be thrown open, so that for the sake of health and free enjoyment of life, they might select their own dwelling place in the cities. Further, that the bonds by which their population, their trade, and for 66 their industry were restricted to a fatal degree be loosened, and that, in short, the Jewish community be considered worthy, by the grant of civil rights, to constitute one united people with the German nation. The Jews, or their attorney Grund, cited the fact that they were classed with dishonorable persons, outlaws, and serfs. The miserable condition of the Frankfurt community, which, after the orders promulgated for the regulation of the town in 1616, had been deprived of natural freedom, and crowded together into the narrowest limits, served as a conclusive proof. The example of France and the Batavian Republic in emancipating the Jews was adduced. But the Jews could hardly have deceived themselves with the fond hope that the representatives of the empire would concede so much to them. They hoped at least to have one restriction removed, viz., that of the poll tax, and this point was insisted upon with great vigor. The most degrading of all these disabilities, they said, is the poll tax, which removes the name of Jew from the category of rational beings, to place it among wild beasts, and forces him to pay his way when he sets foot upon one soil or another. Contrary to expectation, this petition to the representatives of the empire was handed in and supported by the most distinguished member among them, the ambassador from the electorate of Bohemia or Austria. He proposed the motion that the Jews of Germany be allowed civil rights at the end of 1802. Meantime, the Indemnification Congress had other affairs to engross its attention, and its members were unable to occupy themselves with the Jewish question. The petition was buried under a pile of state papers. Nothing was to be expected from the German people, as those who watched the course of affairs readily perceived. The Jews therefore directed their zeal towards inducing the various governments to remit the poll tax. 2 men made therefore 67 names famous in the struggle to remove this odious impost, viz., Israel Jacobson and Wolf Breidenbach. The former, court agent and finance counselor to the Prince of Brunswick, succeeded in procuring the abolition of the poll tax in the territories of Brunswick-Eilenburg April 23, 1803. During a number of years Wolf Breidenbach strove in the same cause, and effected more far-reaching results. Breidenbach was born in a village of that name near Kassel, 1751, and died at Offenbach 1829. He was a man of high culture, noble ideals, and so modest that his name has almost been forgotten in spite of all the sacrifices he made on behalf of the German Jews. He did not, like Jacobson, make provisions to have his name spread far and wide. Deeply moved by the annoyances and the contemptuous treatment inflicted on Jewish travelers in places where the tax was imposed, which came daily under the notice of Breidenbach in his business journeys, he determined at least to have the poll tax remitted, and applied himself with all his energy to this task. Quietly he strove to have the chain loosened, where it weighed most heavily. He perceived that large large sums of money would be required to provide presents for the police magistrates and the city clergy under the pretense of giving alms to the poor, and also to erect beautiful monuments in honor of magnanimous princes who would allow themselves to be influenced to leave the Jews untaxed and unoppressed. He was not able to meet this enormous expense out of his own means. He therefore issued a summons to German and foreign Jews September 1803, asking them to subscribe to a fund, from which the cost of abolishing the poll tax might be defrayed. It was well known at the time who circulated this appeal, but out of modesty, Breitenbach did not append his name. By these means, and through negotiations with the minor German princes at the Diet in Ratisbon, 468 carried on with the friendly help of the imperial chancellor, Dalberg, and finally by the recommendations of the princes themselves, who learned to esteem him, Breitenbach succeeded in obtaining the right of free passage for the Jews throughout the Rhineland and Bavaria. Even the narrow-minded, Jew-hating, most noble council of Frankfurt was moved by Breitenbach's petition to abolish the poll tax exacted at the gates and bridges. The petition of the Jews to the representatives of the empire for civil privileges, however restricted, the feeling displayed by several princes in favor of removing their bonds, and other signs, made the Jew-haters of Germany suspect that the old condition of imperial serfdom would soon vanish. They were terror-struck. They could not conceive the idea that the downtrodden Jews should be raised from their abasement in Germany. This painful idea induced a host of authors, most of them jurists, as if by mutual agreement, to employ all their efforts in various parts of Germany in opposing the deliverance of the Jews from slavery. Among these men were also Grabauer, Buckles, and many anonymous writers, who persisted in their hostility for several years 1803 to 1805. They displayed hatred to the Jews, so malignant that it savored of the days of the Black Death, of Capistrano, Pfefferkorn, and the Dominicans. They produced an artificial fog, to prevent the spread of rays of enlightenment. In former days it had been the servants of the church who had branded the Jews with dishonor. Now the priests of justice assumed this part, and by perversion of justice sought to keep the Jews in servitude, for which course Fichte had prepared the way. As soon as the petition of the Jews reached the representatives of the empire in Ratisbon, a jurist of South Germany opposed it, urging that 1,000 reasons existed why Jews were unworthy of becoming citizens of the empire, and the provinces 469, the greater number and the most obstinate of the representatives of this Jew-baiting movement had their seat in Bochum, the city of enlightenment and of the Christianity taught by Schleiermacher. The character, teachings, and history of the Jews, even their prophets and patriarchs, in fact, everything Jewish, was attacked by these cowardly writers, most of whom wrote anonymously, and was made the subject of foulest abuse and vituperation. The leaders of Berlin Judaism were at a loss how to oppose these systematic onslaughts. David Friedlander remained silent. Then David resolved to write an answer, but wisely abstained. The parts were now changed. In the days of Mendelssohn, and for some time afterwards, the German Jews had acted as guardians to the French Jews whenever the latter had any grievances to redress. Now Friedlander had made the French Jews so powerful and confident that they repulsed every attack upon themselves and their belief with courage and skill. The Berlin Jews, who had always been ready enough to boast of their courage, at the first hostile attack found themselves helpless as babes. In their perplexity they solicited the aid of the police, who issued an order that no pamphlet either for or against the Jews should be published. This step was regarded by their antagonists as a sign of cowardice or a confession of powerlessness. A new abusive tract, entitled "Can the Jews Remain in Their Present Condition Without Harm to the State?" gave additional weight to the accusations against them. What were a number of the most wealthy Jews or their fathers 20 or 30 years ago? Hawkers, who crawled about the streets in ragged clothes, annoying the passers-by with their importunity to buy some yards of Ostend hair ribbon. Or rustics, who, under the pretext of trading, stole into Christian dwellings, and often did damage to their owners. This writer proposed to render the Jews harmless by means more revolting than those employed in the Middle Ages. 470. Not only visible color upon their coat sleeves, but in order to prevent their increase, the second male child of each Jew should be castrated. Protestant theology and German philosophy proposed regulations against the Jews unrivaled by the canonical decrees of Popes Innocent III and Paul IV. In Barrow appeared similar libels which inflamed the hatred of the populace against the Jews. Even the well-meaning writings composed in their defense by Christians, such as Cosman and Ramsden, a word to the impartial, admitted the low character of the Jews, and seemed to imply that in every way it would be better for Christians if there were no Jews among them. But seeing that the evil existed, it must be endured. The honor of the Germans was partly redeemed by a man who belonged to the olden time, Friedherr von Dietrich, once a major in the Russian service, to whom love of mankind was no empty phrase. He warmly defended the Jews against the venomous attacks of Gradnauer and his malicious allies 1803 and 1804, and thereby laid himself open to the charge of having been bribed. In view of the general prejudice against the Jewish race, he was prepared to see himself caricatured and represented as riding upon a cell or an ass. His kindly but pedantic pamphlets in defense of the Jews were not sufficient to close the mouths of their opponents. Equally inadequate and fruitless were the attempts at vindication made by Jewish writers outside of Berlin, who found it necessary to lift their voice in opposition to the general outcry against their people. Two Jews, one from Königsberg, the other from Hamburg, hit upon an excellent plan. Both recognized that the Jew hatred of the Germans could not be refuted by solid and weighty arguments, but might be silenced by ridicule. They were the forerunners 471 of Bini and Hein, one being an unknown physician, the other writing anonymously Lefebvre. The former, in a satirical pamphlet written under the name of Domimicus Haman Epiphanes, expressed the opinion that unless all Jews were speedily massacred, and all Jewesses sold as slaves, the world, Christianity, and all states, must necessarily perish. Mankind would benefit enormously by the sale of the Jews, all immorality would thereby at once diminish, and the immortal Gradnauer, who had originated the glorious idea and had disseminated his noble abhorrence of the Jews, would everywhere be acknowledged a benefactor of mankind, and be deservedly commemorated by temples and monuments. The other satirist, Lefranc, called his work Bellerophon, or the defeated Gradnauer. He wished to kill the chimerical monster Jew hatred in Gradnauer by mounting Pegasus. He addressed the Jew Bader with the scornful thou. Thou who hast grafted with so much success jurisprudence upon theology, thou who didst exalt in how art indeed at exalt who hast studied ignorance and stupidity under the great Sembler, if thou art so proud of thy Christianity, that with contempt thou dost look down upon Jews, then pray let me ask thee why thy prisons are crammed with criminals condemned upon charges of high treason, murder, poisoning, robbery, and adultery? First remove from thy midst the scaffold, the gallows, the rack, the scourge, and all the ghastly instruments of torture and death, not one of which was invented by the Jews. Divest thyself of the demon, and then wilt thou pity a people condemned to engage in traffic against its will, and accused because it does traffic. Deceit is said to be a widespread vice among Jews. Thy Christian tailor robs thee, thy bootmaker gives thee bad leather, thy grocer false measure and weight, thy baker despite prosperous harvests undersized loaves. Thy wine is adulterated, thy manservant and thy maidservant combine to cheat thee. Thou thyself and the innocence of thy heart first for sale wretched lies and spiteful malice written upon blotting paper, for 6 farthings, which are not worth 6 pence, and thou darest assert that fraud is peculiar to Jews. See whether among all the bankruptcies now occurring in London and Paris there is a single Jewish failure. Thou dost foolishly repeat the silly prattle of the great wit, when thou dost remark that the Jews constitute a state within the state. Thou canst not forgive the Jews the crime of speaking correct German, of dressing more respectably, and often judging more justly than thou. They no longer wear beards, which thou canst for 72 pull. They no longer speak gibberish, which thou mightest mimic. The Jew for over 20 years has striven to approach the Christian, but how has he been received? how many alterations has he made in his canonical laws to be able to join you? But from pure humanity ye turn your backs upon him, yet thy pamphlet appears to me to be a good omen. The average man believes that winter can be
Thanks for
parted from
tuning in.
summer only by terrible thunder and hailstorms. Thus
See
is
you
it
next
with thee. Persecution, fanaticism, and super